You're live.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our 13th Ask Me Anything live video series. If you missed the 12th Ask Me Anything on citizenship delayed, naturalization, and voting for new Americans, you can still see it on HIAS Pennsylvania's YouTube page, on our website, which is www.hiaspa.org, and in the video section of HIAS Pennsylvania's Facebook page. My name is Cathryn Miller-Wilson, and I'm the Executive Director of HIAS Pennsylvania, a nonprofit whose mission is to provide legal and social services to immigrants and refugees. Today's Ask Me Anything is part of Young Involved Philadelphia's State of Young Philly event series and will go a little longer than 30 minutes, so stay with us. Thank you for joining us for Young Involved Philadelphian's State of Young Philly. Our theme this year is Start Local, Get Vocal. We would like to thank our sponsor, Temple University College of Liberal Arts Master of Public Policy program. Young Involved Philadelphia's goals are to engage, connect, and represent with young Philadelphians throughout the city. The Civic Engagement Fair is currently happening online and can be accessed via this QR code right here on the screen. To connect with Young Involved Philadelphia online, check out our socials and our website. Also join us for our closing event and find more information on our Facebook and Instagram page. Okay. Thank you, Young Involved Philadelphia. So today, our conversation will focus on what does immigration reform look like? Over the past 4 years, anti-immigrant policies have proliferated. Nearly 1,000 policies attacking immigrants have been issued by the current administration since January 2017. These have consisted of narrowing grounds for asylum to banning immigrants from certain countries. With the upcoming election and each candidate's differing immigration stance, we asked what immigration reform will look like in the coming years. Thank you to everyone who has submitted questions already. We're excited for our conversation today. If you haven't already done so, please submit any questions you have during the next half hour in the comments section below. If we don't get to them during this live conversation, we'll answer them in the comments. Please keep your questions general. If you have specific legal questions or need legal representation, please contact HIAS Pennsylvania directly. We are not allowed to give legal advice on Facebook Live. We would also love to hear your ideas on topics for future videos. We hope that through this video series, you can ask any questions you have and learn the truth about immigration and refugee resettlement in the U.S. Today, we're excited to be speaking about immigration reform and the Immigration Hub's 2021 Action Plan with Darcy Gallego of the Immigration Hub. Darcy is the Legislative Associate at the Immigration Hub. She supports the development and implementation of the Hub's federal advocacy work. The link to the action plan itself can be found in the comments below. Welcome, Darcy. So I'm going to start with some questions from me. Who is the Immigration Hub, and how did you come up with this action plan?
First, thank you so much, Kathy. Happy to be here with you all. Happy to be here with you, the viewers. So the Immigration Hub, we're an organization based out of Washington, D.C., a national organization that focuses on advancing just and fair immigration policies through 3 different ways: through communications, legislative advocacy, and strategic partnerships. As for the 2021 action plan, we started working on this actually a little bit over a year ago, along with 100 other organizations and even more advocates. We started this process about a year ago and having some conversations about what would we want the next administration to do on immigration, right? So it definitely took a while to sift through those 1,000 policies that you mentioned, Kathy, that this administration has put forth, and not only thinking about how to undo those policies, but how to go further, right? How to really interrogate the basis of the immigration system and how it exists right now, and the fact that it's essentially based on the criminalization of immigrants, right? And this has been happening for the past 2-3 decades or so. So it's how do we go beyond that which was in place before Trump came into office under Obama. So that's a little bit on the process of how it came about. The action plan is essentially an articulation of that lengthy work that we did with those advocates over a year or so. And the goal of this version of the work in these 10 action steps is to make it really clear as to what it is that we want this next administration to do on immigration. And then just a quick note, most of what's included in the action plan is actually administrative. So these are policies that can be implemented by the administration on their own without Congress. There are some points where you'll see that we'll reference pieces of legislation that we obviously want the administration to focus on, but largely these are things that they could come in and immediately start working on. So we put this out there not only to make our presence known as immigration advocates, but to also make it clear that we're going to be watching, right? We're going to be following what the next administration is doing, that not just because we win an election, we're going to sit back and be content with that we've witnessed and experienced so much harm, so many attacks from this administration, we are all the more motivated to ensure that these things are undone and that we go further in ensuring the well-being, the protection, the liberation of immigrant communities.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And what is the top priority that you would say for immigration reform and why?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I think it might be helpful to take a couple of steps back, right, and give some context for folks who might be joining who may not know too much about prior attempts at immigration reform. So we've seen, multiple iterations of attempts at what's been called comprehensive immigration reform in the past, most recently in 2013, and these have largely been attempts, bipartisan attempts in Congress to address, the multiple facets of the immigration system. I want to note that in these prior, negotiations, legalization or any attempt to redo the legal immigration system was always coupled with increased enforcement. And that's important to note because when we're discussing immigration reform in a bipartisan way, right, often the discussion is, well, we need to have more enforcement if we're going to give any benefits or protections, right? I want to note, though, that although those policies never, were passed on the Hill, we've seen a really incredible ramping up of enforcement under this administration. We have seen, through these 1,000 policies, everything from raids on workplaces, everything from raids in sanctuary jurisdictions, to the implementation of policies like expedited removal, to increased border enforcement. We've seen this obsession with the border wall. We've seen this deviation of millions of dollars toward constructing the structure on the southern border and essentially keeping out asylum seekers who have the right to seek asylum in this country. So I just wanted to give that context. And then say that the number one priority, precisely because of all this enforcement that we've dealt with, is legalization for our community without that added enforcement. We want to make sure that in whatever the vehicle might look like, right? We don't know what that'll be, whether it'll be a large package like we've seen in the past, or whether we'll see attempts to perhaps attach legalization provisions onto, let's say, maybe an economic recovery package. That would all depend, right? But what we want to make clear is that we do not want any further harm inflicted on our communities because, frankly, we have borne far too much in these past 4 years, and we cannot take any more. So I would say that's really the number one priority. And then as to how that relates to the action plan here, as I had mentioned before, the action plan is administrative, right? But it's important that it's coupled with that legislative package that we hope will come on the earlier end of the next administration to really, restructure this system, re-envision what it is that immigration looks like in this country.
That's really great. I'm glad you took a step back. I want to take a step even further back just to provide some context for our listeners. What do you say to someone who says, okay, well, I can understand that enforcement harms immigrant communities, but what about lack of enforcement harming broader communities? Isn't that a concern? And what do you say to that?
Yeah, that's a tough one, right? We've heard that a lot used by the right, and it's a message that Trump has employed relentlessly, justifying this increased enforcement. And I'll use an example, I think, to illustrate it the best, specifically when it comes to sanctuary jurisdictions, right? So what are sanctuary jurisdictions for viewers who might just be tuning in? These are localities or states even that essentially have made it clear that state and local law enforcement will not work with federal immigration enforcement, right? So that means that folks will not be immediately turned over, per se. If you were to call, if you're a victim of or a survivor of domestic violence and you call the police, you're not going to be handed over to immigration, right? And my counterpoint to this argument of, well, for the protection of us all, right, is it actually protects us more so if all of our community members feel safe and secure in reaching out to law enforcement in the first place, right? And there have been studies conducted on this that are truly alarming, the extent to which people will suffer and not denounce folks who are committing crimes against them just because of the sheer fear that they will be deported, that they'll be handed over to ICE. So the question I always pose when someone raises that is, so whose safety are we talking about, right? Like it cannot only be, when we're thinking about community safety, it can't only be citizen safety, right? We as a community, as a country, cannot be safe unless all of us feel safe. So I think that's, an important note, and we'll talk about it a little later too. When it comes to legalization, like, why is it important that we even talk about legalization in this next administration? We're going to have so many priorities, right? Our country can't prosper unless immigrants prosper, right? Because immigrants are an inherent piece of the fabric that makes up this country. So I think that at the root is really what should inform all of these conversations.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate that response. And if you'll forgive me for stepping out of my questioner role, I just want to add to it about how it impacts citizen communities. That the reality of sanctuary policies is that most of them violate the Fourth Amendment, which says that you can't arrest people and detain them without a warrant. Mm-hmm. So if we are allowing that to happen in the name of immigration enforcement, then we're destroying the fabric of our due process rights for everybody, and that should be frightening to everyone. That impacts everyone. And I also just want to add and echo what you've said about not just safety but thriving. Study after study after study have shown that immigrants, because by the very nature of being immigrants, they bring innovation and entrepreneurship, all of which are key economic pieces to the puzzle. And in this moment where our economy is in free fall because of the pandemic, we should be more concerned than ever about bringing innovative entrepreneurial ideas to the United States to help us get back on our feet. And we can only do that by allowing legal pathways. So yes, I very much appreciate. So that context is why we're talking about making things fairer and easier and more legally accessible. Mm-hmm. So that brings us to my next question. When we're talking about immigration, who are we talking about specifically? Are we talking about people that are here, people that are reuniting with families, asylum seekers and refugees, other people? How do the 10 action steps that you guys laid out address all of these different groups of people?
Mm-hmm. So I think this question gets at the root of sometimes confusion, right, that exists around immigration overall, because precisely if I've heard so many people ask this very same question, who are we talking about? What does this really mean? So the way I describe it is I almost think of immigration as this umbrella term, right? When we're talking about immigration, it's an umbrella. And what falls under that is precisely the buckets that you outlined. One, as you mentioned, folks who are here. Two, folks who are looking to reunite with family members who are already here. Three, asylum seekers, and 4, refugees. And those are just high-level buckets, of course, right? We could always, go further down. But starting with the group of folks who are already here, I think about it in folks who have protections already. So when we think about that, folks who have DACA, so for people listening in, that's a Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program that this administration has waged an unrelenting campaign against, literally since it took office. Another program is a temporary protected status program, in short, TPS program, TPS holders. Those are folks that have work authorizations and who are protected from deportation, right? So that's kind of one bucket. What does the action plan do for them? What it does is not only undo the harmful, pieces and attacks of the administration. So with DACA, the first step is restore the program, right? We saw that after a favorable Supreme Court decision, unfortunately, they put out a memo that essentially ending the program as we know it, curbing the protections that were available initially and closing off the opportunity for people to submit new applications. So the first thing is restore the program in full, and also to expand the caps. So something that I don't think we talk about enough is that even when the DACA program was put forth in 2012, a lot of people were left out because they didn't, meet the requirements. They were too old, frankly. They were brought here as children, but didn't meet, that threshold. So that's another piece, expanding those caps, encouraging the administration to revisit those requirements, the education requirements that also left out a lot of people. And essentially, in short, just making sure that those people are protected and have work authorization, and making sure that new applications can be accepted. So that's on one side. For TPS, similarly, making sure that no TPS holder is at the risk of being deported, making sure that every TPS holder has the ability to, continue having work authorization. And there's just another court case that came down relatively recently in the Ninth Circuit that unfortunately ended up siding with the Trump administration. This means that by March at earliest, folks could start losing status. So it's really important that, literally on the first day, if not the very first days, the next administration immediately, redesignate those countries, some of which, include El Salvador, Honduras, Haiti, Nepal, ensure that those people have protections, but then go a step further, right? We know that there are a lot of people who could really benefit from the protections of TPS, including people from Venezuela, Cameroon, Guatemala, countries where, there are, conflicts, and folks can't go back there. And just this week we heard of, deportations of Venezuelans back to Venezuela, it's heartbreaking, right? That should not be taking place at all. And I'll get into that later when we talk about detention and deportation and all. But that's just one example of how the action plan addresses folks who are already here, who have status. As for folks who do not have status, so are part of the broader undocumented population, we're proposing and urging this next administration to be creative with the ability that it has as an administration to put into place other deferred action programs similar to DACA, to use parole in place, which is a tool that's used most often for military families, but maybe expanding that to use it so that it's another opportunity for folks to have a status, to be protected, and to have the ability to work. As for people reuniting, we've seen, and it feels like I say it with every topic, like relentless attacks, and that's really what this has been by this administration. It's every possible avenue really has been targeted in some way, shape, or form. We saw it at the onset of his administration, first with the Muslim ban. We've seen more recent iterations that were expanded to include folks from countries in Africa as well. And those bans, what they do is basically keep people from coming to join family members, in part, right? So an important step is immediately repealing those. And the good thing is that the Biden campaign has, included that in their platform, so that's great. Another, barrier that's been put into place that we immediately call for, undoing is the public charge rule that some of you may have heard of. And we refer to that also as a wealth test, because that's basically what it is. It's looking to bar low-income immigrants from having the ability to obtain a green card. And it's led to widespread fear in our communities to the extent that folks, have been not seeking out help even for their citizen children out of the fear that maybe that would affect their green card application, which is horribly disheartening. So that's another way that the action plan addresses it. Moving on to asylum seekers, if any system has been attacked relentlessly, more so maybe than others, is the asylum system. And I call it's really like a calculated, systematic attempts by this administration to dismantle it across the board. And in effect, it has, unfortunately. And a number of steps have to be taken that we outline there. Number one is withdrawing these decisions by the Attorney General and the Board of Immigration Appeals that essentially narrow the definition that allows folks to obtain asylum. So it immediately disqualifies victims and survivors of gender-based violence, sexual violence, members of the LGBTQ community, victims of gang violence right now are not considered, could not fulfill, the requirements of asylum based on these decisions. So immediately withdrawing that and doing this slew of regulations, and I'll just name a few because it's far too many to go through in just a couple of minutes, unfortunately. One of them is it's what's essentially a transit ban. It's a rule that was put in place that essentially keeps you from being able to apply for asylum if you reach our southern border if you traveled through another country to get here and did not apply for asylum there first. So what does that do? Almost automatically disqualify folks who are traveling from the Northern Triangle countries, so El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. Just by virtue of going through a country, just Mexico, really, you're disqualified. That's one. Another is what we call unsafe third country agreements that officially are asylum cooperative agreements that claim essentially that people should be seeking asylum in the Northern Triangle, despite the fact that folks are fleeing these countries and seeking asylum here. So there have been instances of people, being flown to El Salvador if they're from Honduras and being told you should seek asylum in El Salvador. Well, that makes no sense because, similar conditions. So those are just a handful, really, of the regulations that we would immediately seek to undo. And thankfully, in large part of what I'm mentioning, the campaign has already indicated interest in doing away with these things. So that's great to hear. And then lastly, on refugees, I think it was just a couple of weeks ago that we saw that the president put forth a presidential determination of only 15,000 refugees. It's the lowest ever. And in consultation with organizations that work directly with refugees and advocate for refugees, the ask on day one is at the minimum to increase that number to 125,000. So it's something that we put in the action plan because it is such a priority. And if you all might recall, there was an attempt by the administration to basically make localities and states have to approve whether or not refugees would be accepted, just to, another way to complicate the system. And there's incredible mobilization across the community and ultimately was stopped in the courts. But what needs to be done is to rebuild the refugee program almost from the ground up as well. So that's something we included in there because these groups said the infrastructure is almost not there right now. We need to rebuild it. So I know that was really long-winded, but those are some of the ways that we address, those different buckets under the umbrella that is immigration.
Thank you so much. No, I think it's appropriately long-winded because there's a lot of questions. But just to sum it up, and I appreciate it. It's in summary, if I may, and you can correct me, seeking just more paths to legalization. Which again, I think we want to remind our listeners, what is the point of immigration policy? And while I think we can all agree that countries want to figure out, who can come and who can't come and under what circumstances, when you create a situation that just puts millions of people in a vulnerable legal status, that's not good for anybody. Yes. That's not good for anyone because it just makes, you don't know whether you're coming or going. You don't trust the law enforcement. You don't know who you can talk to. You're not sure what you can do to survive. So I think it makes perfect sense that a priority would be just create more paths to legalization. Just make it simple and make sure people can go very quickly out of that vulnerable status, because what is the point of keeping people vulnerable? That's not something that is in anybody's interest. And I guess the only other thing I want to just add to the statements about the refugees is just, again, some brackets. When I became executive director, there were 65 million displaced people in the world, which at the time was record-breaking. 4 years later, there's 79 million. So that's an astounding number in 4 years. And that's really as a result of really two things that are going on: climate change, which is creating ongoing strife and ongoing displacement, and the lack of leadership, which starts with us in trying to address the needs of people that are displaced. And again, ultimately, that hurts everybody, because people are people and people need places to go and they need places to survive and thrive. And so we can't be turning our backs without consequences. So I appreciate that action item and agree completely. Are there any actions that you think will be easier to take than others?
I think, gosh, we really hope, right, that everything could be done right away. I think inherently the challenge that we run up against is like the need to do so much, right, in such a short period of time. And I think it's really helpful that we've already seen the campaign come forward and in their platform very clearly, outline some of their priorities. So I think in terms of, difficulty levels, it'll probably be easier, right, to move forward with those that have already almost been like pre-identified on their end. So the moratorium, for example, which is huge, and that I don't know if I've talked about, but the moratorium is essentially a halt on deportations. And the goal is to have this moratorium so that the administration has an opportunity to very critically review the policies in place and hopefully within that time period be able to implement some of these changes so that folks are not suffering consequences of policies that were implemented by the prior administration. And that brings me to a point I wanted to make earlier about deportations and the fact that deportations are ongoing in the midst of a global pandemic, right? So we hope that this is one that, immediately is addressed, that deportations, that everyone understand that, like, to begin with, they shouldn't be happening, right? We don't think they should be happening, but let alone in a global pandemic. We've heard reports of, folks who have been deported essentially taking the virus with them and infecting folks where they arrive. We've heard reports of this happening in Guatemala and Colombia. And then kind of along that same vein on detention, another, priority that we hope will get implemented right away and hope will be easier, is phasing out the use of detention, right? We know that's a long-term, goal, but immediately taking steps to reduce the numbers dramatically of people who are in detention. And this is something that advocates have been pushing for a very long time, but especially at the onset of the pandemic, we have seen such alarming reports coming out of detention centers. 21 people have died in this past fiscal year, so essentially in the past year. There is absolutely no reason why people should be in detention in the midst of a global pandemic. While many of them, a lot of them have claims to apply for asylum, but they are sitting in these cells, right, without access to sanitation, without access to PPE, in crowded conditions. So if I could narrow it down to two, one would be the moratorium, and then two would be detention, as I just said. And other things that we're calling for that we haven't necessarily heard firm commitments from yet is, like I said, phasing it out entirely, phasing out the use of detention. That's something that we could always use, constituents elevating that, really, really highlighting these horrible conditions. Something he has noted in his platform is basically eliminating any relationship with like private contractors that operate these facilities, which we know is a huge issue. And we know in part, it's a lot of the money that goes into this and lobbying and whatnot that contribute to, the widespread use of these detention centers. So that's, a good step. He has committed to ending family detention. I know HIAS Pennsylvania has been engaged in the, close down Berks. So that's important, but we really want to see some commitments and action ultimately to phase it out. And what we're proposing, and it's in the action plan, if you look through it, is basically reallocating the enormous amount of money that is right now earmarked for detention to organizations that can work with these people, right? That have, are called case management programs. There are other ways, right? And a note as well, so many of these people have family here, right? They should be able to be released, be with their family, and check in periodically with a nonprofit, right? That they're working with closely, and then that way, like, they're held accountable and can go in with their meetings and such, but don't have to be behind bars, right? And we shouldn't have corporations profiting off of this either. So another long-winded one, but those I would say are the two that I hope, I think a lot of us hope will be implemented and changed, right away.
No, I appreciate it. I think it makes a lot of sense. Particularly, I mean, isn't it true that prior to the last 4 years, for the most part, ankle monitors were used with success. There were no issues. So to then suddenly take, I don't know how many millions of dollars and dump it into facilities that jail people is neither good nor moral nor efficient or effective.
Right.
So there's so many problems on so many levels when you had at your disposal something that was working fine, the ankle monitors, right?
And that's one of the arguments, that it's so much cheaper to work with nonprofits to, develop really robust programs. It's so much, it makes sense. I had a stat that the government has spent over $300 billion in immigration enforcement. That is more than all the other federal law enforcement agencies combined. So that, for context, is just the enormous amount of money that's being pumped into the system that, like you said, frankly, should not exist the way that it does. There are other alternatives based in family unity, in the potential for someone to thrive in the community, right? In what world is it that the best solution is having people behind bars when they came to this country, right, seeking, if not protection, seeking to be reunified with family? So those are just, other things to kind of think about.
Right. So we have time for one last question. So I just wanted to know, what can the average listener do to help ensure that these actions can happen?
Yeah, so I would say a great first step is just listening in to this live stream right now. And I'd encourage folks to follow organizations that are doing this work and have been for years. A lot of these organizations will put out action alerts and really will call attention to when there's an important vote happening, or there's a regulation that was put forward and there's a comment period closing and anyone can literally submit a comment. Some organizations off the top of my head, if you're not already following them on social media or signed up on their email list, are Detention Watch Network, United We Dream, Raíces, based out of Texas. Those are just some, and they elevate resources from other organizations as well. So that's really one way. And then another way is to be vigilant, really, to pay attention to what's happening, even if it doesn't affect you, and actually more so if it doesn't affect you, right? All the more reason to care about what's happening to the most vulnerable amongst us. I think what's important, and what the whole point of the action plan really is that, and I mentioned at the onset, despite us potentially, hopefully, winning the White House and Congress, that doesn't mean everything's going to be solved overnight. We need to pay attention and make sure that we are pressuring our elected officials, even if they are, of the party that we agree with, even more so of a reason to push them, to be in dialogue with them, to call their office consistently. Hey, I see this vote is coming up. Please think about immigrant communities. Or the next time, even on your local level, something that's important too is see if is your community, do they have inclusive immigration policies? Do they have a welcoming policies? And if not, maybe try to start a conversation, especially in the context of COVID, where the federal government has left undocumented folks and their families without any relief. I'd say it's really important to see how your local community, how your state government can fill in and support those communities. So in short, follow organizations that do the work. And second, don't be afraid to hold elected officials accountable. even in these next 4 years, it's going to be so important that we just continue, this practice of engaging with officials on policies that we care about and that affects the most vulnerable among us.
Oh, I'm so sorry. um, Apologize for that. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate all of your answers and all of the work that you and Immigration Hub are doing. It's really, really terrific. We have reached the end of our federal advocacy portion, but we hope that everyone that's listening will continue to advocate for those changes at the federal level, just like Darcy had recommended. And I want to pivot specifically to supporting immigrants in Philadelphia. We will be holding an Ask Me Anything with Pennsylvania advocates in January, so you can definitely learn more details then. But in the meantime, there are 3 critical issues that impact Pennsylvanians: driver's licenses, detention facilities, and attorneys for detained immigrants. Immigrants without status or in the process of getting status are not able to get a driver's license in Pennsylvania, but there is no reason for this to be the case, especially since PennDOT is already providing an alternative to the Real ID. Providing immigrants with driver's licenses not only provides them with the ability to legally drive and a form of identification, but also ensures safety for all Pennsylvania drivers by expanding the number of persons eligible to take a driver's test. There's currently a bill pending in Harrisburg that would permit all immigrants in Pennsylvania to get a driver's license. You can call your state congressman or senator today to advocate for amending Title 75 so that everyone is eligible for a driver's license. And you can learn more about advocacy for driver's licenses for immigrants at www.drivingpaforward.org. And you can also get involved through that website. As Darcy mentioned, closing down detention facilities is a top priority over the next few years. Remember that there are alternatives to detention. It's just a waste of money and really problematic. So please support initiatives such as the campaign to shut down Berks. Berks is a facility that detains families right here in Pennsylvania. Better than separating them, but unnecessarily forcing families to spend years behind bars is also a problem. You can go to www.facebook.com/shutdownberks coalition to learn more. And finally, the other cost of detention is the need for lawyers. If you're going to take somebody's freedom away, then you should be giving them an attorney if they can't afford one themselves. And the reality is detained immigrants who are put behind bars just like any other prisoner, don't have a right to a free attorney if they can't afford one. One of the firmest principles of due process of law is the right to have representation if you can't afford it when your liberty is at stake. The Pennsylvania Immigrant Family Unity Project, otherwise known as PIFUP, is a pilot project started by a coalition of immigrant-serving nonprofits which provides publicly funded legal representation to immigrants in court. Our coalition is working to ensure the government provides lawyers to immigrants in detention, the only people who are locked up by the U.S. government and not provided with representation. Learn more by signing up for the newsletter at www.paifup.org. And one more critical note, just to make sure that everybody listening knows, HIAS Pennsylvania remains open during the pandemic. We have been open throughout. We're continuing to provide remote legal services, including citizenship, to immigrants in the greater Philadelphia area. As always, you can learn more about how to support DACA recipients, asylum seekers, and other immigrants and refugees at www.hiaspa.org. And we cannot stress enough the importance of voting. Make sure that your vote is counted and that you participate in our government because it has consequences for all of us. Thank you again, and take care.